Dr. Brown, I am excited to have the opportunity to participate in this interview with you. I have been able to read the book, read a little bit about your background, and I want to thank you for the contributions that you've made to Baltimore in your book. The Black Butterfly, The Harmful Politics of Race and Space in America, covers the issues and possible solutions that offer hope, especially in the communities of Baltimore. Dr. Brown, I'm aware that you are a former associate professor at Morgan State University, but what I would like you to share with us is a little bit more about yourself, what brought you to Baltimore, and what led you to put Baltimore under the microscope.
Well, thank you for having me. I guess a little bit about me. I was born in West Memphis, or lived in West Memphis, Arkansas, born in Memphis, Tennessee, across the river, even though we lived in West Memphis, Arkansas. And so I'm really a son of the South. My grandparents were Mississippi sharecroppers who, just like millions of other Black people, left the deep, deep South during the Great Migrations and went up to leaving Mississippi, went to Memphis, and both of my parents ended up picking cotton. But they all, I think, became a great generation, to go from enslaved people to sharecroppers to, my mom being a physician assistant, my grandfather being a Baptist preacher and administrator of the church he was pastor of for 40 something years. And my grandmother went to New York, became a seamstress, and, was a powerhouse in her own right. So, I'm their grandson, I'm their son, I'm their um, descendant, that's sort of building on a legacy of, Black people who were looking for a better life for themselves. And, and it really connects, as I talk about in the book, with millions of Black people leaving the Deep South, coming to cities like Baltimore, to cities like Philadelphia, Detroit, New York, to try to find a better life and get away from some of the white supremacist violence in the Deep South, the lynchings, the destruction of Black economic districts and cities like Rosewood and Tulsa, Greenwood and Tulsa, and only to arrive in these cities and find that urban apartheid was being erected and enforced. And so I think that's the story of my family in many ways is connected to the story of the book. I've had a few people tell me that they see, either they're African American, they say they see our story, or they are from Baltimore and they're saying, I see the story of my family, for someone who's deeply rooted in Baltimore. And so, that gives me great satisfaction to know that people are seeing their stories and our story in the text. What brought me to Baltimore was a postdoctoral fellowship. I was a Kellogg Health Scholar in 2010, and I finished my doctoral degree at the University of Memphis Health Science Center in Tennessee, or University of Tennessee Health Science Center in Memphis, and finished that in 2010, came to Baltimore at Morgan State University and became a postdoctoral fellow. And then I was hired as an assistant professor back in January 2013. So that's how I made it to Baltimore.
Wow. And I wish you were still here.
I'm back. I am back.
Oh, you did come back. I see. I
Yes.
did not know that.
hmm
When did you return to Baltimore?
Oh, at the end of last year, I wanted to be in Baltimore when my book came out. I feel like I wrote and spent so much time delving into archives and
Yes.
going to libraries to find the material, and it meant a lot to be back here when the book made it to the shelves.
Well, I think that was a great decision because I'm sure everyone in Baltimore who has an opportunity to meet with you and talk with you want to hear more. Um, Now, when you began the journey of writing your book, how did you come up with the title, The Black Butterfly? And what was your vision for the book and who was your intended audience?
Well, the story of the Black Butterfly begins when I coined the term. I believe it was by the summer of 2015, which was right after the Baltimore uprising, after the death of Freddie Gray on in early April, and then the uprising on April 27th, 2015. So I was looking at a racial dot map that was created by Dustin Cable at the University of Virginia, and it didn't have a boundary of Baltimore on the map. So I drew the boundary of Baltimore on the map, and as soon as I did that, it's just the pattern jumped out at me like, whoa, this is like a butterfly, because in East and West Baltimore, that's where African Americans are concentrated, and it spread out like wings. And so I said, okay, that looks like a butterfly. And I was thinking about Kendrick Lamar's hip hop album called To Pimp a Butterfly, which had come out several months earlier. And I liked the notion of the way his title alluded to the way that something that's beautiful can be exploited, the way that something that's beautiful can be have challenges, but there's still this beauty. And so I said, oh, well, I'm going to call it the Black Butterfly. And I'm pretty avid user of social media, and so I started using it on Facebook and Twitter, and before I knew it, like, it just took off. People, particularly when visual artists, grabbed it and ran with it, that's when I think it really took off. There was a graffiti artist named Nether, and he painted on side of a building next to I-83, Jones Falls Parkway in Baltimore, the L and the butterfly. And you couldn't miss it, and it was up there for like several months. He painted a mural with a black butterfly in the shape of a clouds or sky with clouds in the form of an L, also symbolizing the white L and black butterfly. And other artists, began using the Baltimore Civic Stage. They created a Baltimore conversation series, Baltimore Butterfly discussion series. A hip hop artist named Sun Zulu created a song called The Black Butterfly. So people were just like artists once they started using it. And I should say Baltimore Civic Stage, they created this logo, and it had this like beautiful butterfly as a part of their logo for that series. So people started using it, and artists started projecting it in many ways, and it resonated, I think, in part because of its fusion with artists. So it was a social science concept, but artists gave it, I think, a form of life that people could sort of grab onto. And so I think the audience then or the intended audience for not just the book, but for the original terminology, the audience was for people in Baltimore, for them to understand that racial segregation is a root cause and a core reality that shapes outcomes in the lives of Baltimoreans in Baltimore City. And so that was really, I think, the original audience. And so I think the book really is an extension of that original notion, and really sort of trying to help people understand at that time, particularly, here's why the city experienced an uprising. This is why this type of thing is happening in our country. And at that time, it was Ferguson, then Baltimore, then you had a little bit later St. Louis, Milwaukee, you had Baton Rouge. These cities were having these riots, uprisings, these civil disturbances at the time, and they were all really a prelude to what we saw last summer, what I call in the book the Great Rebellion, after the death of George Floyd. So that was, I wanted to write the book, I think, for Baltimoreans, but also I think for audiences like policymakers, so that they could see why the city was the way that it is, and other hyper-segregated cities could see why they are the way they are, because Baltimore is a Category 5 hyper-segregated city. Like a hurricane, Category 5 is the most devastating form of a hurricane that we know. So is Category 5 hyper-segregation. And Baltimore is in that category with cities that we know very well: Chicago, Flint, Detroit, Birmingham, St. Louis, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Baltimore. Those are the top 8 Category 5 hyper-segregated cities. So really the audience is for these Category 5 hyper-segregated cities: the policymakers, the activists, public health folks, because I also wanted to explain to my public health colleagues, the data that we look at with disparities, health disparities, they don't come out of nowhere. There's a whole history behind them. And really, the entire thesis of the book is also a public health thesis, and that is that we cannot make Black lives matter if we don't make Black neighborhoods matter.
That's very interesting. That was one of the things that actually caught my attention. It just jumped out at me that about the Black Lives Matter, but Black communities need to matter first. And that was just one of the things that I felt like, especially after the death of George Floyd, that it opened people's eyes and ears, to make it more than a Black issue of only that only Black or African Americans or people of color understood. All of a sudden, it brought us a platform to bring all of us together to want to try to find some equity and equality in our lives.
Absolutely.
So that was pretty important piece to me when you said that.
Absolutely.
Throughout the Black Butterfly, you speak on the devastating and repercussions of redlining, hypersegregation. How do you get to the broader population, not just to understand their effects today, but be motivated to change them for the better? I know that there are a lot of people who don't believe that redlining actually exists, or in my mind, they don't really understand what redlining is. Can you go into more depth between that and how you can connect the past with the present?
Sure. Redlining really comes from a federal policy passed by the United States government, an agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So during World War II, and the coming out of the Great Depression, you are trying to recover from the Great Depression. You had President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. They were working to try to get the American economy moving again. And so part of that was rescuing savings and loans in the banking industry, because many of them, of course, collapsed during the inception of the Great Depression. Bankers jumped out of windows. People were going bankrupt. I think they called it Black Friday, Black Monday, in 1929 when that took place. So the federal government took a more vigorous role in the housing market. And so the Homeowners Loan Corporation, well, the federal government began to guarantee loans in banks, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation was designed to jump start the housing market again. And so the way that they operated was to draw up these maps in over 200 cities, and they were technically called residential security maps. So you have to ask yourself, residential security from what? Residential security from who? And when you look at the maps, it becomes clear. If you want the scholarly breakdown and analysis, pick up Antero Patella's book, Not in My Neighborhood, How Bigotry Shaped a Great American City. He has a great chapter in there on the pseudo science called eugenics, and how that racialized pseudoscience was used as the background for these residential security maps. So these residential security maps had four colors on the map: red, blue, yellow, and green. The red is the origin of redlining, but there were four colors on the map, as I mentioned earlier. So that in fact, what was happening was you had blue lining and green lining that provided structural advantages and capital access to white communities. And in his scheme, where he analyzes the pseudoscience of eugenics, you had white Anglo-Saxons who were the people living in the green communities. You also had white people living in the blue communities, but also you could have Jewish folks living in those communities, because many times they were excluded from living in the green communities, like Roland Park, the neighborhoods that the Roland Park Company developed in Baltimore. The Roland Park Company, one of the premier suburbs in the early 1900s, developed four neighborhoods: Roland Park, Guilford, Homeland, and then later the Northwood communities. So that those four neighborhoods, developed by the Roland Park Company, they pioneered under General Manager Edward Boughton. They pioneered community-wide racially restrictive covenants, barring Black people from living in those communities, but also informally barring Jewish people from living in those communities. So that's where the green lining is distinguished from the blue lining. So meaning the Jewish community lived in the blue neighborhoods,
Mm.
and the yellow neighborhoods were often European immigrants, many times who had fled Europe after World War One, or even previously. But your Italians, Polish, Russian Jewish folks, people who were getting out of Europe because it was a hotbed of violence. So they came to America to find opportunity, like many immigrants have always done in this country and still do. And so they lived in those immigrants often lived in the yellow line communities. They were struggling. They were trying to become American, still speaking their original languages, and they were relegated to those yellow line communities. And so African Americans and urban Native Americans lived in the red communities. And so what you find from this history is that, and the evidence, you find that home lending was dictated by the color of the community that you lived in. Green and blue communities received access to capital and great interest rates for their home mortgages and small business loans. Yellow, it was considered more risky because, again, these were immigrants often living in these communities. So it was iffy if or not they were going to receive those loans from the banks. And then the red communities often were denied, more often than not, denied loans, denied lending, denied access to capital. And that's what people mean by redlining. But keep in mind, all four colors are happening at the same time. So redlining results in the hyper deprivation of resources, and green lining and blue lining result in the hyper allocation of resources. So they're both happening at the same time. And that's where you get that structural disadvantage. And we talk about red lining, but we don't talk about blue lining and green lining, giving white neighborhoods and white communities this tremendous structural advantage and access to capital.
Wow.
Oh, and then I should mention the Homeowners Loan Corporation later becomes the Federal Housing Administration. So this is the same FHA that we have today operating to guarantee home lending. Uh, this is the FHA, their predecessor, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, that developed these racialized maps rooted in the pseudoscience of eugenics.
That's really interesting because the focus is really is usually redlining and people not understanding. But to open it up to say, oh, there are more lines than a red line that we need to be concerned about, is probably something that many people have not heard before. So I actually absolutely thank you for that. And one of the things that came to mind when you said that was when we're talking about transportation. And in your book, you were kind enough to mention and share your view on the rail transportation that was going to happen in the red line district, one of the red line districts, which was going to be the red line. You want to speak a little bit more about that and how that did not come to pass, even though it was in the works and it was in the 10-year plan, and all of a sudden now it doesn't exist.
Sure. Well, one place to start is actually realizing that, going back to the pattern that I discussed earlier. So you have the white L coming down the middle of the city and then going east from the inner harbor along Alisana out to Dundalk. So that's the white L, and then you have the black butterfly in the wings. So we already have a light rail system that runs north south through the white L. The light rail system that exists already runs from Hunt Valley out in Baltimore County. It snakes its way through the white L, running past Camden Yards, where the baseball stadium is, where the Orioles play, and then it runs further south through and ends up at BWI at the airport. So you have transit access. You have transit, a beautiful transit, light rail access running through the White L. So it's the east-west axis in the city running through the black butterfly where the red line was needed and where the red line would have run. And so this is why I call it transit apartheid. You have transit structural advantage in the white L and transit structural deficit and disadvantage in the black butterfly. And so the red line light rail system, which was in the works for several years, would have helped to remedy that and provide that east west access, and especially for people living in East and West Baltimore in the Black Butterfly. And so it was in the works, and then the Hogan administration came along, they canceled it. And so the federal dollars which were attached to it, I believe almost $1 billion, were sent back to the federal government. And those, of course, it never was built, and those monies were not allocated towards building the red line, providing that east west access. It was later found that the governor ended up sending millions of dollars to rural, more demographically whiter neighborhoods or areas, counties, for highways. So they were giving this access, these dollars for increased transit access with highways in the rural counties, but this majority black east west access that would have provided transit equity in the Black Butterfly was denied. So I believe actually the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and maybe the Baltimore Transit Equity Authority or Transit Coalition filed a lawsuit alleging civil rights violation due to the disproportionate allocation or the racialized allocation of those funds, reallocating them from a majority black area to the rural, demographically whiter counties.
That, yeah, that was interesting. And I know that that in itself did get some legs and a lot of people complaining and a lot of people upset. But then it becomes quiet. And then nobody talks about it. And so it makes one believe that, okay, it happened. Oh, well, let's move on. And in your opinion, and which I value so much in your book, you discuss several strategies to deal with things like this and how to move forward. You know, how to go from the past to the current to the future. Um, but in dealing with issues impacting the Black butterflies, such as blight, health disparities, high crime, which you've mentioned, are just not happening in Baltimore, in Baltimore cities and counties. They're happening across the country. And you've mentioned some of the other states that you recognize these are happening in. As realtors, our focus, of course, is on housing, neighborhoods, and communities. In your book, you focus on making Black communities matter. Why do you believe this is essential, and especially essential for worldwide communities?
Well, I mean, I guess worldwide, I believe African people are there are at least billion people of African descent on the planet. And if there's 7 billion people on the planet, then we're at least 14% of the global population. So we're global citizens. We're global residents wherever we are, whether we're in Haiti or Colombia, on the continent of Africa, or right here in the United States. Black lives matter. And if we want to thrive as a human species, if we want to thrive as human beings, then we have to ensure that all communities across this globe have the resources, the infrastructure, and the access they need to thrive. And so, I think, it's just that simple. Every global citizen should have the right to live in a healthy, thriving community, location, or area, wherever they may be. And so, I want to go back a little bit to that point around transit, because a lot of people say, well, these black people, they need to get jobs, need to get a job and pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Well, that's what having access to transit would allow them to do. The jobs are often in the suburbs. So if they have access to get to those jobs, that's exactly what they can do. They can get that job, they can earn an income, and they can make ends meet. But when you're in a transit, living in a community characterized by transit apartheid, now you're locked into that community. You're in what the president of the Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition calls transit detention. It takes more than 45 minutes to get to work. When you're in transit detention, it's very difficult to be able to get that job to provide for your family and make ends meet. So this is the thing, this rhetoric that we have in the nation around people needing to be self-sufficient. Well, it's hard to do that when the infrastructure isn't put into those communities like it is put into other communities so that they can thrive.
Do you believe, as far as transportation is concerned, because you have come up with a lot of possibilities and probabilities that could exist to help in Baltimore, Baltimore getting better. The transportation issue when it comes to the red line, do you ever think that that will resurface to a point of conversation to be able to say if this were to be um, if this were to come to fruition, this could really combat a lot of the things that surround joblessness, health disparities. What do you see that as a possibility of resurfacing when it comes to rail transportation?
I mean, I think it's possible. I think the reason why it's died down, relatively speaking, is because the governor that rejected it is still the governor. So I think if there's a Democratic governor, we might see a different impetus and different push behind it. But even with that, the Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition, led by President Samuel Jordan, they have continued to push for this. They haven't let up. And so I think that's actually something we should note. I particularly personally, um, I think about, even if those dollars don't come back, I think that we should still be looking at other alternatives. And this is me personally, because I know the red line advocates still want the red line. And my thing is, there is this new technology out of China. I believe it's called trackless. Like, they have like a trackless rail system where it's on wheels, but then it's like electronically guided along the road. It's pretty interesting, but I think it costs less, but it could actually be a form of at least an in between solution until, if and until we're able to actually go and get those red line dollars, bring them back, or with the Biden administration, with the Democratic governor, those are the stars that have to align. But my thing is, I think that there are in between, potentially innovative trackless rail system that could be looked at that could help bring about transit equity until those red line dollars come about.
Okay. One of the things that Another thing that caught my attention is so much good content in your book, and I hope everybody takes the time to read your book. It's a deep dive. It has a lot of information, a lot of resource information and things like that that people can go to. One of the things that was noticeable was that you talked about the Baltimore apartheid. And I'm not sure that initially I understood what you meant. So, but in reading, I actually did. But what was your thought behind using Baltimore apartheid when I know that there's an American apartheid and things like that? How did you focus down on Baltimore as an apartheid and share that message in a way that it gives a visual to people as they're listening to you?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing I'll mention is that there's a scholarly basis for that language. So, Princeton sociologist Douglas Massey and his colleague Nancy Denton, they co-wrote a book called American Apartheid in the 90s. And so that language was put out on the table at that time. Later, there's a scholar named Mindy Thompson Fullylove at Columbia University. She used the language, and when she used it, she was talking about both racial segregation and forced displacement, uprooting African American communities repeatedly. Then there's a University of Maryland scholar named Garrett Power who wrote a paper called Apartheid Baltimore Style, in which he details and outlines Baltimore's history of racial segregation. Baltimore Mayor John Barry Mahul passing the first residential racial zoning law in American history on December 19th, 1910. So he outlines all that in his paper. So I lean on that scholarship and I say, all right, American apartheid at the national level, apartheid Baltimore style at the local level. So I just took the two words, flipped them, and put Baltimore apartheid on the table, leaning on the scholars who had been talking about this since the 90s. So about almost going on 30 years now. So that was really the basis for that. And these scholars, they were talking about hardcore racial segregation, which not only historically, in terms of urban apartheid in America, started in Baltimore City, December 19th, 1910, Baltimore Mayor John Barry Mahole. So not just that history, but its ongoing permanence. Nancy Denton and Douglas Massey, they were using statistics to show that with five different measures of racial segregation, isolation, unevenness, concentration, clustering, and centralization, that in those five measures of racial segregation, Baltimore and those other seven cities I named earlier were ranking the highest in terms of racial segregation. So there's this ongoing, unbroken link between Baltimore starting urban apartheid in America with that residential racial zoning ordinance and it being a hyper segregated city today. And so that's where the apartheid, all it means is being apart. And except in this case, we're talking about, well, it's just like South Africa, the government enforcing racial segregation, or even when it's made illegal, like the 1968 Fair Housing Act, the government doesn't do anything to really remedy it. Now, the thing that they did do to some degree was to try to bar realtors from racial steering, taking white homeowners to white neighborhoods, black homeowners or home buyers to black neighborhoods. It tried to put a cap on realtors actually engaging in racist practices, which really didn't work because it didn't have any enforcement mechanism until 1988. So for 20 years, the Fair Housing Act didn't even have an enforcement, didn't have any teeth until the 1988 provision was put in. And then very few realtors are actually brought up on those type of charges. Now, there are some investigations, some court cases where civil rights advocates have shown and have won. They use testers to show people homes, and they have a black tester and a white tester, and then they send multiple them out multiple times, and they do still find evidence of this racial steering of realtors who aren't actually showing folks the neighborhoods that they have homes in an equal way. So that was one mechanism, but what that Fair Housing Act failed to do was actually there's a clause in it that said that the government had a mandate to affirmatively further fair housing. So that doesn't mean we're only going to stop discrimination. The government actually has a duty. Governments have a duty to affirmatively further fair housing, and that has never happened. No government at the federal level, particularly, and locally even, has gone out and say, you know what, we are going to desegregate America. We are going to, other than court decisions like Thompson versus HUD, where people living in public housing were giving vouchers to live in the suburbs where they had been formerly excluded. So, if outside of a court mandate, like in those specific cases, America has not gone about the business of actually desegregating our neighborhoods, and therefore we remain hyper segregated in many cities and suburban areas across the country.
Interesting. It brings to mind, especially in Baltimore, that of course they've instituted an Office of Equity and Civil Rights. I know you're very aware of it. It's like 21 people who sit on this commission, who are trying to make a change. Do you have any thoughts on that at all, and how it ties into what you're talking about right now when you're talking about Baltimore apartheid?
Sure. Well, I mean, it was that office. It was originally called the Office of Civil Rights and Wage Enforcement. So they
Hmm.
just
Right.
renamed themselves the Office of Equity and Civil Rights. And really, that office, the roots of it at least started in 1964 as a part of the Baltimore Freedom Movement, the Baltimore Civil Rights Movement that challenged Jim and Jane Crow in Baltimore. Now, a lot of people know about the 1961 sit-in movement that started in Greensboro, North Carolina, and it's usually hailed as the beginning of a new push for civil rights. Uh, Freedom marches and freedom rides, Dr. Martin Luther King, uh, all of that, the history people know in terms of kicking into high gear in the 60s, leading to the three great civil rights laws: the 1963 Civil Rights Act, the 1964 or 65 voting right, well, 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Acts, and then the 68 Fair Housing Act. I can't slip because I used to quiz my students on those three great civil rights. So they're going to look at me if I fumble those. So I'm going to say it again: the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Aha! So that's for my students at Morgan State. So I think those three great civil rights acts, people know, okay, that history, really culminating in those three great laws in the 60s. But the civil rights movement was underway in Baltimore. Baltimore students were at Morgan College were pushing desegregation. It starting in 1947. They were engaged in civil rights in sit-ins across from Morgan's campus in the Northwood Plaza. So the sit-in movement is really already kicking off at Morgan College, and those students at that time were pushing to desegregate Baltimore, pushing to make civil rights a reality for Black people in this country, to desegregate the city so that Black people would have the right to live and and eat or sit in or go to a movie wherever they would like. So I think that history really is has a lot to do with how Baltimore apartheid, or really that Office of Civil Rights, really got put on the table to begin with. And so I think that's the thing that I really think about the way that office should be operating today is it should still be analyzing, uh, it should be issuing subpoenas, it should be actively looking to desegregate this city in development projects. Like we have Port Covington TIFs, we have pilots, all kind of development schemes. For folks who don't know, TIFs are tax increment financing. They're bonds that the city issues for infrastructure development whenever new developers come in with them. I'm talking to realtors. Of course, you guys know what this is. So, pilots, payments in lieu of taxes. But, development schemes that, corporate developers use to build these big and great and wonderful projects. But oftentimes they're built for a luxury crowd. They're built for people with high wages. And so we replicate segregation because of the racial wealth gap. Most of the times people that have a lot of money are disproportionately white. So you have to be really intentional with development. And that's the kind of thing that the Office of Equity and Civil Rights should be. They should be analyzing every single development project, every single luxury home, luxury housing. How do we make this inclusionary? How do we make sure it furthers our aim of desegregation? This is the type of thing that we should be doing in Baltimore and the surrounding area.
Based on what you were just saying, have you seen any successes so far that has come out of that commission, out of that Office of
As it
Equity?
relates to development,
Yeah, out of what Baltimore is building as a way of trying to move forward with the renaming of the Office of Equity and Civil Rights.
I haven't seen it because the Baltimore City inclusionary housing law
Yeah.
is tremendously weak. It basically, well, the Baltimore Sun had an article a few years ago that said there were 9,000 apartment units built since that law, the inclusionary housing law, had went into place, but only like 34 or 35 inclusionary units had been built in those 9,000 plus units. So that's telling us that inclusionary housing isn't even happening. And the reason why is because the law is written in a way where if the city of Baltimore does not have, well, it's supposed to provide funds to developers to help subsidize those inclusionary housing units. And even though there are realtors on this that will be listening to this, I feel like I should explain just in case. An inclusionary unit would be like if you have a luxury development where people are going to be earning at least 100,000, that you would set aside 10% of those units in that development for people who are making 50,000 or less. So then you make sure that you're not just catering completely to a high income earning crowd. So this inclusionary housing law is supposed to do that, but it says Baltimore City would provide funding to help subsidize the developers for those units, but the city never has money for those inclusionary housing units. So since the city never
Mhm.
has money,
Right.
the inclusionary housing never happens. So technically the law is there. Well, the law is there. It just doesn't produce any of the right outcomes. So I think, you can't, the Office of Equity couldn't go and actually tell developers to do something that the law doesn't say they shouldn't do. The problem is the law itself. We need a different law that says you will set aside 10% units for inclusionary housing. And then when they don't do that, then your Office of Equity could come in and say, we see that you're not doing that. But right now, it's completely legal. And it's just this. There's a law, and then there's this big water hole at the bottom where the water comes out, and so it never happens. So it's really, we need to have a renewed, vigorous emphasis on fair housing. I think that's the thing that we've lost in America: the emphasis on civil rights, protecting civil rights, and making that fair housing law really have teeth in America.
I totally agree. And when we can get to a point of being able as instructors to be able to facilitate classes that are more modern in content to talk about these kind of activities when it comes to fair housing, the better off we'll be. But of course, we have, especially in Maryland, a 1.5 hour mandate to talk about fair housing, and it's pretty well outlined on the direction of the direction of the conversation, and not necessarily being able to bring in the newer content like you're talking about with inclusionary housing and what that means for communities. One of the things that I'd like to ask you too is moving forward, it's going to require a significant amount of education on all fronts. For people living in these communities, what's their starting point for even wanting to be disrupted, to be able to revitalize communities, and for developers who are interested in inclusionary housing as a starting point, who've never done it before, where do they start?
Well, I'm an educator, so for me, I'm always thinking, why or how can we teach this material K through 12? Because you need citizens and residents who understand this is the legacy of unfair housing in America. And it has always been unfair. We've never had a period where fair housing has actually been not just enforced, but actually willingly done. Except there is one maybe instance where in Maryland where that has sort of been there from the outset, and that is the city of Columbia. James Rouse founded Columbia as an integrated community.
Right.
So you may have asked for an example earlier. That's one example, and then Montgomery County is actually a leader in inclusionary zoning and housing policy. So even though theirs could be stronger as well, but at least, we have examples in Maryland of planning integrated communities from the outset, Columbia, and inclusionary housing policies that have some teeth to them, even though they could be strengthened. But Montgomery County, I think, is a leader in that sense. So it's not like we don't have examples. It's not like we don't have, and we don't have models that we can look at. The key is, how do we teach this K through 12, and then even in higher education. I went through my PhD program, and I wasn't taught the ins and outs of fair housing. And of course, I'm in public health and learning about health disparities, but as you see in my book, I'm trying to educate public health people to let them know you can't think about health outcomes if you don't understand this history of unfair housing, of Black neighborhoods not mattering. Otherwise, you'll just keep going out there saying, well, Black people disproportionately have this disease and that disease without understanding why. And it's that history, it's the policies, the practices, the systems, the budgets that explain it. And so I think that's the thing, that awareness comes from education. And I think we have to look at curriculum. We have to look at what children are learning K through 12, what is in the higher education. There you have some general education courses that undergraduates have to take. From K through undergraduate, senior, becoming a senior in college, this history should be embedded along the way. Understanding the development neighborhoods. I even had a teacher. I've had teachers approach me in the Baltimore City public school system wanting to, do projects around redlining, wanting to do, help lead their students through projects where they, draw, urban or plans for their neighborhoods, uh, urban planning. And I think that's the kind of thing that you need, K through 12. Why shouldn't children in Baltimore be engaged in urban planning? They should have maps of their neighborhoods. They should be envisioning, okay, how do we, improve recreation over here? How do we put in better transportation over there? And they should already be envisioning and thinking and planning so that when they're of age and they're either voting or they're, looking for jobs, that they understand, hey, that's a, it's a job, but B is something, it's a potential career, and it's a place where I can make my neighborhood matter. And I think that's the civic sort of education emphasis that I would love to see, because I think you're going to have a critical mass of people, voters, who are saying, yes, this is what we need. And you can't do that if you don't have an educated populace that's ready to make that happen.
That's interesting. I'm sitting here smiling because I'm thinking that is a generational shift, and that is an educational shift, because it is all of a sudden saying, let's not deal with where we are. We need to get in front of this and try to look to where we want to be. And as long as we stay looking at where we are today, it's a very, very slow moving process. If there's a process moving at all. So being able to have that shift into saying, let's not have necessarily all the adults trying to be fed the information. Let's provide this information to our youth at a level that they understand that they're going to build their future and the future for their children. That's a real shift of a mental state. It really is.
Absolutely. I guess when you're an educator, that's the way you think.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
believe the children are the future.
The
So
children are our future. That's right.
and if
And
the
and
children get it,
and
we're
they
gonna be all right.
that's the truth in it. As realtors, we're looking at all type housing. We're looking at rehabs. We're looking at tear downs. We're looking at vacant land. One of the things that you talk about is the tiny house, and how the tiny house could be a predictor of ending homelessness, or reducing homelessness a lot. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. And that comes in the section of the track or chapter where I'm dealing with uh, ensuring everyone has housing and ending homelessness. So it's a part of other housing solutions. I had someone ask me about this the other day. And so what I'm saying is, for a city like Baltimore, we have plenty of vacant houses. Now, some of them are uninhabitable and can't be rehabbed, but some can be rehabbed. And we have empty public housing units, in the public housing stock.
Yeah.
Wherever we have possibilities for housing, we should be housing people that are experiencing homelessness. Why? Because from a medical perspective, it's the best thing you can do to ensure stability so that people can get on their feet, take their meds, or do whatever, get counseling, whatever they need to do to get their life back on track. So as long as people are houseless and experiencing homelessness, that's not going to happen. And whatever health condition they have will actually worsen and put them closer to death. So medically, housing first. There are some doctors who are actually giving prescriptions for housing, which is an approach that I really love. And so I think that's the way. I'm coming from a public health, more medical perspective. Housing first is a great strategy for ensuring people's health and their wellness. And so out of this range of strategies, I say, well, tiny homes should be a part of the strategy. It may be 5% of the strategy, it may be 15% of the strategy. In addition to vacant homes that we rehab, public housing units that can be brought up to par and people could be housed in those, building new homes. But tiny homes should be a part of that range of solutions that we employ. And sometimes people may need, their own space. uh, you could have a plot of tiny houses, but they could have their own unit, and use that to get stable. And you could have things in what I call autonomous transitional housing communities. So, like in Baltimore, we have like these abandoned schools that were closed, and so you have like a field. I don't know. I'm not good with acreage, but you have a field of urban land that you can put 20 tiny houses on. You could have a community. People could be engaged in community gardening. We could have a solar panel industry so that the solar panels, and you could put on top of those abandoned schools, and now it's supplying energy to the community. You could put free Wi-Fi towers, supply free Wi-Fi. You can create something, a community where people are valued, where they're creating something of use for the communities that are close to them, and they're getting their lives on track. And so that's where I see tiny homes as a part of the range of solutions, because many folks that are experiencing homelessness, they don't like shelters, they don't feel safe, uh, from violence, and then now, of course, we're dealing with a pandemic. So you're bringing a whole lot of people into one place, and you're expecting people to have a mask, and now we're double masking. You're expecting people to have double masks on for whatever the range of time they're there, 12, 13 hours overnight, especially as it's colder now. So, tiny homes are good in terms of the pandemic that we're in right now. Giving people their own space is good in terms of, folks having a chance to get their lives back on track, get the whatever counseling, substance abuse, or substance use help that they need. They have their space, they're off the streets, and they can get their lives on track. So that's where I see tiny homes fitting into a larger housing strategy for people experiencing homelessness.
which is a really great idea and possible solution. I know that some of these tiny homes exist all around the country, but especially in Louisiana, where they had, of course, had so much devastation to occur. And it was one of the things that helped put people back in homes quickly, because tiny homes can be put up so quickly. So that was one of the great resources. But in thinking about Baltimore with the tiny homes, of course, we don't have much land if available. So to
Mhm.
do that means demolishing certain places, and we talk about the negativeness of eminent domain to be able to kind of do some of these things and things like that. Baltimore City had tried to come up with a scope program. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but certainly DHCD, of course, right now with the vacants to value, and which doesn't seem to be getting a lot of leadway into putting people in homes. And because there's so many vacant properties, there has to be a good strategy to be able to look at with these vacant properties that already exist when we're talking about homelessness. Did you have any thoughts on that at all?
Well, I mean, the primary strategy, um, in terms of, I think, a lot of housing, well, you have tax credits and the low income housing tax credit, things of that nature. But, TIFs, the tax increment financing that I mentioned earlier, many of those have been administrated or implemented in white neighborhoods. Particularly, you just had the Port Covington $660
Yeah,
million TIF
yeah.
that was approved in 2016. Westport, where Kevin Plank also owns a lot of property over there. I think he may have sold it recently, though. Um, I think Belvedere Square, which is right there on York Road in Baltimore, that was a TIF as well. I believe developed by, or led maybe by, his brother Scott Plank, if I'm not mistaken. But I think we need black butterfly TIFs. Um, I think, if you have $100 million that you put in West Baltimore, and there are black developers, Sarsfield Williams with Aspire Homes, Veronica Owens with Monarch Butterfly Homes, Laquita Chansey's Smaltimore Homes. She does building tiny homes. Bree Jones, Parody Homes. These are black developers, and I'm sure there are many others, and architects, where we could those are the types of folks that you have $100 million TIF, and you have, and because it costs a good, from they help me understand, it costs 200,000 to 300,000 to rehab, to really fully rehab a vacant home that's fallen into disrepair in the city. So this is not a cheap job that you can just run and do some things with, and especially when you're talking about lead in these houses and things of that nature. So it's going to cost money, and that's actually what TIFs were really meant for. They were meant for addressing blight. So you don't want TIFs. If you're going to do big TIFs, you don't want them in a place like Port Covington. Port Covington is going to be okay. They have a billionaire backer to make sure that project thrives. But what you need is that kind of money and resources in Black neighborhoods to do demolition where you need to do it, but building up homes where people can live in them and have the resources to actually make that happen on the order that it needs to happen in. And so I think, a couple of $1 million won't do it. You're going to need several $100 million. It took $660 million to do a TIF in Port Covington. So if we know that's what it takes to build a neighborhood, then I don't know why would we be thinking, let's do something less, far less in many Black butterfly neighborhoods. So that's my thinking. My thinking is we need large amounts of capital going to Black developers in the Black butterfly, and the city DC, or Department of Housing and Community Development, DHCD, working with those developers to turn those communities around and to do it without displacing the people that live there. And I think that's the challenge. And I think that's what I would love to see Department of Housing and Community Development doing.
That's awesome, because it was mentioned in your book that one of the strategies to heal communities and get communities going was establishing like a $3 billion or $4 billion racial equity bond. Is that in relationship to what you're talking about now, and being able to get the communities back up? And because it's interesting how you were able, I wasn't able to get to how you came up with that number.
Right.
So could you, what's your thoughts?
Sure. Yes, so that project would be folded into the $3 billion racial equity social impact bond proposal that I put into the book. Um, I derived a good portion of those numbers from Green and Healthy Homes Initiative, who said, I can't remember how many vacant or how many homes in Baltimore have toxic lead in
Mhm,
them,
mhm.
but that it would cost around 845 million to essentially de-lead and get rid of lead, or lock in the lead in some instances in those houses throughout the city, so that we can ensure that none of our children have toxic lead exposure. Which, if you care about academic achievement and crime, toxic lead exposure is really at the root of it. And to your earlier question, redlining is at the root of that. So redlining leads to more toxic lead exposure, which then leads to poor academic performance, which then leads to more crime and violence. So redlining and toxic lead exposure are really the issues. So this $3 billion racial equity social impact bond is undoing redlining, and half of those dollars is getting rid of lead. So I said 845 million because some of y'all are like, wait a minute, that don't add up, Dr. Brown. 845 million is not half of 3 billion. And you're right, that's only getting the lead out of the homes. The problem is we have lead in the soil, in the
Yeah.
water, and in the air. So that's where I get up to 1.5 billion, saying we got to get lead out of all of the sources, because toxic lead is a heavy metal that does not belong in the human body at all. And we have lead pipes in our schools.
Mhm.
That's why the Baltimore City public school system gives, when we were in schools, they were administering bottled water, because you cannot drink from those fountains in the schools because they have lead in them, in the pipes. So let's get lead out of our schools, lead out of the homes, lead out of the soil. And then down in South Baltimore, you have pollution that's putting lead in the air. So I'm estimating 1.5 billion to get rid of lead in all of those sources. And I don't know, I could be underestimating, but I think 1.5 billion is a good safe number for that. The other 1.5 billion out of the 3 billion, 500 is for housing first, like I mentioned earlier. So we want to make sure we have, do that's where you can put money towards, Black butterfly TIF to do the housing and to redo the vacants, to do demolition without displacing people and building up neighborhoods. And then the other billion is for things like violence prevention. We need, I think right now there are 10 safe street sites to help prevent violence. We need like 30 or 40 in Baltimore. Substance abuse treatment, mental health counseling, social work. We need, a black butterfly circulator. Maybe that trackless rail system I'm talking about. Maybe you can do some money to put towards that, since it wouldn't cost as much as a full light rail system. But the other 1.5 billion is, or the other half of the 1.5 billion, is to address Baltimore apartheid in housing, in violence, in recreation, and these other areas. So it's really designed to kickstart the redevelopment process and project to help make Black butterfly neighborhoods matter.
It's interesting because when we start talking about money, the city will say it doesn't have money. The state says it doesn't have enough money. The government says we've allocated the best we can. So it's a great idea, but where's the money coming from? And in your book, you talked about the philanthropic groups reallocating some of their resources to possibly address these issues. If that were to happen, and if they were to agree to kind of come together to try to see if they could make that happen, how could they be re-incentivized to make them want to do that?
Well, I mean, I don't know about re-incentivize, but I think, in terms of meeting the mission of any said philanthropy, usually it's a charitable organization that's designed to help ameliorate poverty, designed to help increase, civic engagement, designed to help address urban issues. Well, everything I'm talking about in my book are tremendous urban issues
Yeah.
that need real systemic remedies, or as I say in other places in the book, that need structural healing. And so I think we got to move beyond just thinking about individual healing, but how do we heal structurally as a community? And I think that's designed to do. That's my encouragement towards philanthropies. Do you want to heal just people, a few people, or do you want to heal communities? And if you want to heal communities, then I'm saying you're better off getting the $7 billion in assets that the top 25 philanthropies in the Baltimore area own. You're better off fully funding the $3 billion racial equity social impact bond, because once you get led out of the environment, you're going to have greater academic achievement. You're going to have lower violence. You're going to actually improve program outcomes across the board. You just got to be willing to, I don't like the term invest, you got to be willing to allocate resources for the long term, for structural benefit and healing. And so that's my orientation. That's my pitch to them. Do we only want programs and services, or do we want serious structural healing? And that's my push, and that's sort of my pitch there. So that's the way I sort of frame that.
Let me tell you, it would be a great day to be able to have a lot of these organizations sitting at the table together to try to find out a resolve. And so that they do all hear the one mission, not the multiple missions of the organizations, but the one mission of why this needs to happen for communities, versus an individual given to this group that helps a group of people who live in communities but are temporary communities, because we know that these are going to be short-lived. How do we build communities that are sustaining? How do we make homelessness become something of the past, or at least to minimize it to a point that it's not a problem that can't be solved? Because I do believe that there are a lot of us who believe homelessness cannot be solved, because there's so many people who are homeless, and even if you begin, we get those people in houses, but we've got more that are getting ready to become homelessness because of job losses, or because of something that happened in their background as far as military, whatever it might be. So to be able to have a roundtable discussion with a lot of these organizations to come together with one and create a one mission to build communities that can sustain itself would be pretty awesome to happen. It really would be. So I know you've given us so much of your time, and I appreciate everything that you've talked with us about. And I could go on and on and on with additional questions because you are so knowledgeable. But as a realtor, what do you think real estate agents and brokers and specifically could take away from your book if they when they read it? What is the message that you want them to walk away with?
Well, the biggest thing is realtors played a role and real estate boards played a role in creating the mess that we're in. There's the National Association of Real Estate. I forget what that B stands for, but NAREB.
Brokers, yeah, National
Brokers, thank
Association
you.
of Real Estate Brokers.
So
Yeah.
I don't think I hit on that too heavily in my book, but I do believe I've read how, that organization played a specific role. But in my book, I talk about how realtors and the real estate board of Baltimore City specifically were lobbying Mayor, I want to say Howard Jackson, excuse me. They were lobbying for racial segregation in the 1920s,
Yes.
which I believe is the same time that NAREB was pushing a pro-segregationist approach among the realtor population. So my thing is, if realtors, just like any other group, philanthropy, mayors, city council members, if they or you if your organizations were a part of the problem, and they were, then they and you must be part of the solution. And I think that's actually the encouraging thing. I mean, I think it could be depressing to read my book and say, wow, there are so many things that were done, and how can we undo it all? The encouraging thing to realize is that it was done intentionally. And that's actually good news because it lets us know it can be undone intentionally. If it was random, if it was just oops, everybody, that's in the low income neighborhood deciding to be poor together, it's just randomly happened. Where we gonna be poor, y'all? I don't know. Let's go be poor over there. If that was the way it was, then we'd be in trouble. But what we learn in my book is that it wasn't random at all. Is that policies, practices, systems, budgets, realtors, churches, philanthropies, mayors, city council members, neighborhood associations, they were intentionally making racial segregation a reality. And since that is the case, the good news is we can undo that reality. We can use policies, practice, systems, and budgets. The only thing is, we got to do it at the same level with the same energy that went into making it a reality to undo it. So you can't have $5 billion worth of damage and come in with a $500,000 program talking about you fixing the situation. That's not going to work. If it's a $5 billion problem, then you need to bring a $5 billion worth of solution to the table. And the same energy, if it took, we've been in the mess for 110 years, we better bring 110 years worth of undoing it energy to the table in our fields. I got to do it for public health. That's what I'm working on, my field. Public health, we got issues. So this is what realtors got to look in the mirror and say to yourselves too. Realtors, we got issues. We help create the mess. So let's get to work undoing it.
I appreciate you saying that because we are at a crossroads in our organization to be willing to stand up and apologize for what has occurred, knowingly or unknowingly. As you know, because there are some who said, "Well, I didn't know that." Well, of course you should have known that, right? So,
And that's the
yeah,
problem.
so knowingly or unknowingly, that we have taken the stance to stand up, apologize to the country and to neighborhoods and communities. We were at fault. And now that we're moving towards more of diversity and inclusion and being able to hear the other side, because I think we are now at a point of hearing the voices of the minorities, of being able to say, you think you know what's going on? You think you knew what happened? Let us tell you the real story.
Mhm.
And so for some of our colleagues, I know it's breaking their hearts to hear some of the stories, right? Um, and yet we have others who say that wasn't, I didn't personally do it, so I'm not gonna take responsibility for it. And we're saying, well, you should take responsibility for it because you knew it and you didn't apologize. So I think we are at a place in our lives to be able to say as realtors that we are ready to step up, do better, and to openly police our own to make sure our industry is everything it is set out to be and live by the code of ethics that we have put in place.
Absolutely. And I
So
want people to know I'm not, for the most part, aside from racial steering, I'm not blaming realtors. I'm saying institutions did it. I'm saying governments did it. And even though the people that did it may not still be around, those institutions, those governments are still around. So
yeah,
that's where we have to make the remedy, and that's where we have to take action.
yeah. Well, and I appreciate that, but it's all of us together who had a piece of it.
Well, that's why I
And I,
say racial steering, I'm still going
yeah, right, right,
to,
right,
because that's individual realtors.
yeah. Yeah. So I just thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for taking the time to talk with us and to provide this platform for our members to hear your voice in your book. If they take the time to read your book, which I have done, um, they will walk away, I think, with more knowledge than they ever thought they could have, and to embrace the different things that are possibilities instead of saying it just can't be done. And you are unique in coming to the table, being able to talk about the the disparities that exist, but also to bring possible solutions. And that is unique in itself. So I appreciate you and I thank you. And as realtors, and I'm speaking for my realtor community right now, if there's ever a place that you want us to sit at your table to have a discussion, we're more than open to do that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. And we wish you many, many book sales. Much success. Much success.
It's moving along. So thank you. I'm very appreciative.
Yeah.